She had this gut-wrenching fear he was going to leave. She stayed silent and waited. Mum, I've done nothing wrong. An innocent man doesn't run. I'm going to stay.
Now, Patrick was detained 16 times in 6 years. He was arrested, he was beaten, and he was threatened. But never once was he charged with anything. They began to realise they couldn't frighten him off the land. If they wanted to get rid of him, they were going to have to kill him. And Patrick knew this. His only wish was that his mother wouldn't be there to witness it.
10 long years they spent harassing him. 10 long years he'd done nothing at all. 10 long years they harried and tortured him, piling it on the Shanaghan's all.
Whenever Patrick was detained in Castlereagh, in between beatings, he used to practice his dance steps in his cell. And you could hear the clickety-clackety sound of his feet on the concrete floor echoing throughout the place. And on one occasion, when he was dancing in his cell, there were other men who'd been detained in Castlereagh, and they could hear Patrick, and so they started cheering and clapping and shouting. And afterwards, Patrick said, "Do you know, on that occasion, I had a captive audience. And it was the one time I was not late." Why do you dance in that lonely prison cell? Beaten and in pain, what makes you so strong? The sound of your feet echoes through the silence, and I wonder what makes you carry on. I try to understand that prison cannot break you. A prisoner in a cell can be captive yet still free. A people who have pride in their history and culture can never be brought down to their knees. For there's strength in your music, wisdom in your stories, courage in a poem and power in a song. The rhythm of the dance like the heartbeat of your people, 800 years proud and strong.
Why do they stop you, harass you and beat you? And I wonder why you are a focus for their hate. A gentle Irish farmer, a loving son and dancer, hounded and tortured by the state. Then I understand it's to destroy your culture. For centuries they've said being Irish is a crime. You know you have the right to the land and farm you work on. Pride in who you are means stepping out of line. For there's strength in your music, wisdom in your stories, courage in a poem and power in a song. The rhythm of the dance like the heartbeat of your people, 800 years proud and strong. Poetry and song in your native language, written by those who knew that death was near, brought light and hope to a dark and filthy prison, gave strength and courage to help their pain and fear. Now I understand why you keep on dancing. A prisoner in a cell can be captive yet still free. A people who have pride in their history and culture can never be brought down to their knees. For there's strength in your music, wisdom in your stories, courage
in a poem and power in a song. The rhythm of the dance like the heartbeat of your people. 800 years proud and strong.
His mum Tina and dad Eamon were good friends of the Shanaghans, and Emmett particularly looked up to Patrick. Well, one summer they were coming back from the holidays, and normally Emmett wouldn't be looking forward to this, but this year it was different. Because before they'd gone away, he'd ordered a brand new pair of trainers from his mum's catalogue, and he couldn't wait to get home and try them on and show them to Patrick. So when they got home on the Sunday night and the trainers hadn't arrived, he was really disappointed, went off to bed really miserable. Early the next morning, the doorbell rang, and there was a postman with a parcel. Tina opened the door and took the parcel, and Emmett came charging down the stairs. "Mum, Mum, it's my trainers!" He grabbed the parcel and started ripping off the plastic packaging, and there on the side of the box was a picture of the pair of trainers. "Mum, great, I can't wait to try them on and show them to Patrick." He tried to get all the tape off the box when the telephone rang. Tina went into the hall to answer the phone, and Emmett struggled with all the tape. And suddenly, he heard a terrible sound from his mum in the hall. He went to her. "Mum, what is it? What's the matter?" Tina couldn't speak. She stood there holding the phone, trembling. "Mummy, what's happened?" "Emmett, it's Patrick. Patrick's been shot." For a split second, Emmett hoped this was some kind of terrible joke. And then he realised it wasn't. He threw the half-open box of trainers onto the floor and held onto his mum.
Word went round. There'd been a shooting.
Patrick's van had been seen in a ditch.
They said they'd turned the doctor away.
They said he was already dead.
They said they were trying to preserve the crime scene.
And the priest had been turned away too.
He'd had to make a 20-minute detour to get through the next checkpoint.
It was lunchtime before the undertakers collected the body.
They switched on the radio to see if there was any news. But all they heard was,
A 33-year-old Catholic man was shot near Castlederg this morning.
Mary heard the terrible news from friends who came to the house. Anna, Patrick's sister, was in England, and she got the phone call that she'd always dreaded, and immediately set off for the airport to be with her family. Mary, Patrick's other sister, was in Limavady. She made the journey home that she'd never wanted to make. All over Ireland, there were phone calls, and people started to make their way to the Shanaghan farm, just outside Castlederg. And you know, you can go up to anybody from that community and ask them, what were you doing on the day that you heard that Patrick Shanaghan had been murdered? And you know, to a man, woman or child, 99% of them will tell you exactly what they were doing.
The RUC, they put up checkpoints either end of the lane leading up to Patrick's farm. But if they thought that would deter people, they were wrong. Despite being stopped, photographed, questioned and searched, people came from all over Ireland to pay their respects.
When Patrick's remains were brought home from Omagh, the RUC insisted on accompanying the hearse. So there was one RUC Land Rover directly in front of it and one directly behind. And that meant the car with the family and friends in couldn't get close to the hearse. They couldn't even see it. Their view was blocked. And then they had to drive through the village of Killen. The first thing they noticed as they approached the village was just how many police there were. As they started to drive slowly along the high street, it was like running a gauntlet. There were RUC officers lining both sides of the road, smirking and jeering. There was Special Branch sitting in their cars, the radio on, laughing, and there was loyalist music blasting out from the local Orange Hall. And then, just as they were leaving Killen, a flock of sheep blocked the road, been let out deliberately.
And on the day of the funeral, they were surrounded again by RUC officers, while a helicopter circled overhead. And in the fields beyond, British soldiers could be seen with their rifles trained on the mourners, as the family and friends gathered round the graveside in the little church at Achierne.
Then, as the months passed, the farmhouse grew empty and silent for Mary, full of painful memories.
Sitting by the fireside, you hold your son's photo, gently caressing his image, framed with loving care. In your eyes I see pain and anguish, silent with your memories and a grief no mother can bear. Time may not heal, the pain may never fade, but friends and family are beside you. In your darkest night, oh Mary, you're not alone. Your friends and family are beside you.
Afterwards, some people couldn't face dancing anymore. It was as if the dance had died inside them.
Standing on your doorstep, the last rays of evening spread sunlight across your farm in a warm, gentle golden glow. On the land there's a shadow, the fields a silent witness. Secrets in the earth that the world was never meant to know.
And when they did go to Cayley's, they kept expecting to see him. If someone came in late, they'd look up, expecting it to be Patrick.
Looking at your garden, crocuses and snowdrops, pale morning sunlight on flowers turned towards the day. In your eyes I see pain but also pleasure. Does your garden help to keep your grief and sorrow at bay? Time may not heal, the pain may never fade, but friends and family are beside you. In your darkest night, oh Mary, you're not alone. Your friends and family are beside you.
Many expected Mary to leave, but she said, "No, this is our farm, our land. husband stayed, and Patrick decided to stay. I won't be driven out.
So Mary carried on for 4 years, never expecting to hear anything more. I mean, the RUC weren't interested. And anyway, if you were a Catholic, you wouldn't go to the RUC for anything, not even if you'd been buried. Then, 4 years later, completely out of the blue, the telephone rang.
Mr. Shanaghan, I'm from the Irish Post. How do you feel about the decision to postpone the inquest into the death of your son Patrick?
Inquest? What inquest?
Yes, we nearly got away with it, but we tried to sneak it through. Damn press got hold of it, so we had to postpone. Quoting again from the manual, "The law is another weapon in the government's arsenal and must at all times be tied into the war effort." Well, 6 months later, we got our stories straight and we were ready. So, let the courtroom dance begin.
You were the first officer to arrive at the scene.
Yes.
Is this a true account of the events of August the 12th, 1991?
Yes.
Are you sure you don't want to make any changes?
I don't need to make any changes.
Then, can you explain how you were dispatched to the scene of the crime at 8 a.m. when the incident didn't happen until 8:20 a.m.?
Stop. That evidence is beyond the scope of this inquest.
At what time was an ambulance called?
I didn't call an ambulance.
Well, who did? Please check your records.
There doesn't seem to be a record.
You were sent to the scene of a shooting, and yet you failed to call an ambulance.
Stop. That evidence is well beyond the scope of this inquest.
Did you know the identity of the victim?
No, not at that stage.
So it could have been anyone, even a fellow officer. And yet you failed to call an ambulance.
Stop. That evidence is clearly well beyond the scope of this inquest.
How many cars were sent to the scene?
One.
Why was only one car sent?
The others were tied up at an accident.
What sort of an accident?
It was a serious road traffic accident.
Serious, eh? Was anybody killed?
No.
Seriously injured?
No.
Anybody actually hurt at all?
Well, no.
So, you're telling this court that to a minor road traffic accident you sent 3 cars, and yet to a shooting you sent only 1?
Well, due to the particular lie of the hills in the area, there was a radio black spot, so we couldn't contact the other cars.
Would like to present evidence from Mr. John Corrie.
And who's this?
Mr. John Corrie went to the scene of that road traffic accident. His car was fitted with a standard commercial taxi radio, and he was able to radio the base station in town with no radio interference, no black spots whatsoever.
Taxi? No. That evidence is clearly well beyond the scope of this inquest.
Why were no plaster casts made of the tyre of the car that the killer used?
Don't know.
Why was an eyewitness to the murder only questioned once on the morning of the murder and never recalled to go through a sequence of events?
Don't know.
You made no attempt to investigate this murder whatsoever, did you?
We took all normal investigative procedures for an incident of this kind.
Would like to present evidence from Mr. Darrell Manners.
And who's this?
Mr. Darrell Manners was employed by the Home Office Forensic Science Service for 14 years. He was called in by the family as an independent forensic expert. In his opinion, the investigation into this murder was wholly inadequate and totally defective.
I see. Home Office. Time to kick it up the system, I think. Apply for a judicial review. Verdict of the judicial review. That evidence is beyond the scope of this inquest.
Would like to present evidence of constant death threats against Mr. Shanaghan by named RUC officers.
Dear oh dear, you're really not very good at this part of the dance, are you? Time to apply for a second judicial review. Verdict of the second judicial review. That evidence is well beyond the scope of this inquest.
And so it went on. There were 2 judicial reviews, and the inquest was adjourned again and again. But the most shocking piece of evidence came from a Mrs. Delia Hogg, who said,
I saw the yellow van in the ditch and assumed there'd been an accident. Then I saw the body of a young man lying across the front seat. His head was moving, and so was his arm.
and that is how the family found out that after Patrick had been shot, he was still alive. At the time that Patrick had been denied a doctor, denied a priest, he was still alive. Finally, the verdict of the inquest came.
On an inquest for our Sovereign Lady the Queen, at the County Court Division of Strabane, the following matters were found. Name of deceased, Patrick Sean Shanaghan. Age, 33. Occupation, general labourer. Cause of death, bullet wound to chest.
Well, after the inquest, Mary Shanaghan had this to say. That inquest was a terrible ordeal for us. It made no attempt to get to the truth of Patrick's death, and it just confirmed my belief that collusion between the security forces and loyalist paramilitaries had led to my son's murder. And perhaps the most alarming thing to come out of this inquest is that the police don't care that we know they made little attempt to investigate Patrick's death. They don't care that he was unjustifiably harassed for 10 years. And they don't care that there was evidence of police collusion in his murder. And for me personally, the most distressing thing to come out of this inquest was the blatant disregard for Patrick's life. Not the slightest effort was made to call an ambulance. And even Patrick's parish priest, Father McGinn, was rerouted and delayed from reaching Patrick in his final moments. As in life, my son Patrick was, in death, denied the most basic of human rights.
Well, after the inquest, everyone was outraged. They felt it was time to dance to their own tune. They had to do something.
And then Father Joe said, well, why don't we have our own inquiry? A people's inquiry.
And someone else said, well, what's that? Who'd do that for you? And someone else said, we can't do that, can we?
They'd heard about other families who'd been through the same thing and held their own inquiries. And they talked to them. And afterwards they said, well, still not quite sure what one is, but we'll have one anyway.
First, they needed money. Now, normally it's quite hard to raise money, but not this time. As soon as they put the word out, there were bucket loads of it coming in. From Cork to Derry, there'd be a Cayley in Armagh, a concert in Kildare, and they'd do a whip round. And then they started to realise just how many friends Patrick had. It was incredible. People were turning up at 11 o'clock at night with plastic bags full of money, bucketfuls of notes and coins. And then the CAJ got involved. They're a group of independent human rights lawyers, and they brought a judge, Judge Summers, over from America to hear the evidence.
And people came to tell their stories, even if for some this was dangerous and they preferred to give their stories in private or in writing. But all the evidence and all the stories that had been denied at the official inquest were heard. After 3 days of the people's inquiry, the truth, the whole truth, was out in the open.
And it was a healing process for the whole community. And then, the report got published. Everyone was so proud of it, and it got sold everywhere. Hundreds and hundreds of copies all over Ireland. And you know, in 1 week it actually sold more copies than Harry Potter. Then, when they started to think about what they'd done, the way that they'd connected the stories and tracked the evidence from start to finish, it made them realise just what they had got. A clear picture of the way justice works in the north of Ireland. And they felt they were vindicated when, at the end of the inquiry, Judge Summers said in his summing up,
I have never seen a case in which all the evidence points so clearly to one conclusion. Patrick Shanaghan was murdered by the British government, specifically with the collusion of the RUC. It is impossible to find clean hands in this police force from top to bottom. When will the people of England awake to the crimes committed in their name?
And then Paul McGeehan from the CAJ approached them and said they wanted to take their case to Strasbourg, to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, taking a case to Strasbourg is a complex thing. You have to have a hearing to see if you can have a hearing. And that's as far as most cases get. But they thought, well, why don't we go? In fact,
why don't we all go? So they organised flights.
Hired a car.
found a route on the internet. A 1, 2, 3.
Oh, we're all off to Strasbourg in the morning, where our human rights glisten in the sun. But when they first got to Germany, the first thing they had to do was sort out the puncture in Paddy's wheelchair. But fortunately, Ingeborg, one of Patrick's German dancing partners, was there to meet them, and she managed to get it sorted in a jiffy. Then it was into the hire cars and down the Autobahn to Strasbourg. And you know, despite all the flyovers and the underpasses, the iron gangs and the asphalts, well, they never got lost once. And you know, to this day, they will swear Patrick was up there, looking down, looking after them.
So there they were at last at the European Court of Human Rights. And they walked into the courtroom. It's massive. It was more like a parliament chamber than a courtroom. And there were loads of them. As well as the motley crew from Castlederg, there were families of the other cases being heard. Families of Gervase McCurr, Pierce Jordan, the Lochall families. At one end of the row there was Paddy in his wheelchair, the other end was Anna feeding the baby, in amongst them all, Mary Shanaghan. And at one end of the room was a row of 13 judges, one from each of the European countries, including Britain, although they didn't hold out much hope from him. And it was intimidating for them. Most of them hadn't been in a room with one judge, let alone 13. But they felt so proud of their young Irish lawyers as they stepped forward to argue the case of Patrick Shanaghan versus the United Kingdom.